Welcome to Wear Your Cape to Work, a podcast hosted by Project Insight. We believe that project and program managers are the real superheroes of every organization. We want you to hear their stories so you can be inspired to wear your own cape to work. Our guest on today's podcast is Lucas King. He has worked over 8 years in the international development space, most recently at DAI. He's a project manager who helps to implement projects in other countries for USAID. And he's on the front lines of tackling social and economic problems on multiple continents with multi-million-dollar budgets. He's here to tell us about the unique role he has and the unique risks in managing humanitarian effort projects around the world. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, Lucas. We're so glad to have you on Wear Your Cape to Work this week.
Thanks so much, Trina. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, Matt and I are excited to get to know you a little more because we haven't had someone from your background on the podcast yet. It's exciting to talk to someone who, by their own description, is $1 million budget wrangler, I think, or negotiator. But we'd like maybe for the audience to hear a little background of the work that you've done as a project management professional with USAID projects and for the company DAI that you are working for. Maybe tell a little bit about what that organization does and how they're responsible for the funds from the federal government to reach other countries and do work around the world.
Okay, sure. I like that Wrangler. I might have to use that now. I'm from Idaho, so cowboy culture there and Wrangler.
Nice.
It's a great connection. So I started working in the USAID space about 6 years ago. DAI is a federal contractor, mostly focused on U.S. government contracts, but there's another portion with private sector and then also international branches as well in England and the UK. So we bid on in open procurements on U.S. government projects, mostly United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And there's a very competitive process, and the agency reviews the proposals and then selects the implementer. And there's some bigger firms that win a lot of these projects because they have the built up capacity. So DAI is typically one of the top firms that does it just as amount of scale.
Wow, that's amazing. So this is a project that the government would like to accomplish, and the contractors come in to bid on those projects themselves to say, we can accomplish this for you. Is that essentially what you're doing?
Yes, exactly. So I'm sure I won't get this 100% correct, but from my understanding is USAID will take policy cues from the State Department. And so each administration has their particular objectives that they'd like to achieve in certain countries or regions. And so while USAID is in charge of implementing the work and assuring the objectives are met, a lot of the policy cues will come from the State Department. So what that looks like in practice, typically you'll have a mission for each country. That's not always true. Some countries don't have missions. And it's usually attached within the embassy. So you'll have a country director who's in charge of, mission director who's in charge of the mission, and they sit within the embassy. And then there's a whole team under that person, technical team, procurement team, finance team, and then they direct the projects. So there's obviously the political part where it comes from what the State Department says, like these are the objectives we want to do in the country. However, a lot of the work is obviously based in stakeholder engagement and beneficiary engagement. So the what we call cooperating country national, CCN, there's like the staff in the country they're usually typically people from that country who are and we're talking about the technical team here, who are like experts in what is happening on the ground. So they're political science experts, they're economists, and they know really well what's happening. And so they can devise these projects to achieve objectives that's partially based on State Department objectives and then also based in the reality of what the country needs, right? The local government needs or that the people need.
So many great minds. Oh my goodness. So these
Yeah,
objectives that want to be accomplished, and then people on the ground that you're saying who have great minds about what's needed and the strategy therein. And then
exactly.
here you are in the middle as this
Yeah,
project orchestrator, again, sorry, Matt, here we go. Superhero, right? This
Yeah.
superhero of
Yes.
execution from what one group wants to see happen. You're helping them execute it for another group's benefit and strategy. Can you talk a little bit
hmm
about what it's like to be in the middle of that? Like, not really my objective, not really my end game, but let me run this project for you.
yeah. And to make it even, I wouldn't say maybe not more complex. Honestly, it might make it simpler. Is that it's not DAI. It's never DAI. It's USAID. It's from the United States government, from the people of the United States. And that's really important. Branding and marking is very important for USAID. And so when we're implementing, we implement as USAID. We're a USAID project. We never have we have DAI on internal reports. I mean, we say internal, like all the reports that we do are public. They're posted on the development um, something clearinghouse, DEC deck, which unfortunately is no longer online anymore. But everything we do is public. But we always implement as USAID. We're never DAI. So I guess that makes it a little simpler in that we're the middle men women, but we're under the kind of the front of the U.S. government.
Well, that's really like the undercover superhero then, right? Is
Yes.
you're doing
Yeah, I
your
put the
work and
glasses on as
yeah, exactly. You've got that
Clark
trench
Kent
coat
there.
on with a
Yeah.
little, US flag on it and then getting it done with all
Yeah,
the
I
other
have a shirt in my
stakeholders.
closet with the USAID logo. It's one of my prized possessions. I'll hold on to that for a
Wow.
while. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing because you are representing. Do you find that there are projects, and this may be off limits, I don't know, we'll see, but do you find that there are projects whose objectives you're going to execute, but you don't necessarily relate to? I was going to say agree with, but I more mean like it doesn't
Yeah.
resonate necessarily, but you're going to help execute this work?
Well, one of the big pillars that these implementing organizations get chosen to do the work is their institutional capacity or the team members, the actual people, so the expertise they have. So we had very strong economic growth uh, teams, market systems teams, public financial management, local governance. That is what we do, right? Agriculture. Um, so we wouldn't, as a company, I'm saying, we wouldn't propose on something we don't have the expertise or believe we could actually execute to quality. So as a person, um, my focus is on education and youth development. But I'd say at my time at DI, I was probably only on 25% of my projects was on that, and so um, and we don't necessarily there's some amount of choice, right? But there's also like the business need where you need to put your employees because it's a for-profit business, right? Um, so you don't always get to choose what kind of project you're on.
Hmm.
In my role as a project manager, that wasn't so important because we're not really doing much of the technical work. But if you get hired on the project, you're most likely going to be, that's like what you want to do and how you want to be there and where you, that's like what you want to do and what your expertise is. So a lot of times, there is that high level kind of policy objective. You're like the actual work you're doing, you believe in.
That's really nice, especially if you get to, be in that space that you feel most comfortable in the education and the youth spot, right? I imagine that must be a little bit more exciting projects for you rather than maybe sometimes working on agriculture or places that you don't have that background in or whatever that would be. But how did you end up here? How did you end up doing this?
Good question. It kind of fell in my lap, to be honest. I mean, I went to graduate school in London, University of East London, and I studied NGO, non-governmental organization, and development management. So I had at that time, imagined myself working for NGOs or nonprofits or charities. Uh, and I wanted to get into the management aspect of it, which is development management is a little bit different than kind of like your PMI standards. But obviously we do use some of that methodology or process and practice. And so when I graduated, I was looking for roles in London. And this space, international development, is highly competitive, very, very competitive in Washington, D.C., in London, in these big donor headquarter areas, very hard to get into. And so I had a dozen interviews for volunteer roles that I didn't even get. And so I was just kind of applying for anything and everything. And DAI has an office in London. I applied and I even interviewed for a few roles for that company. And I applied for a technical writing position in Honduras, and I didn't hear anything back. And I ended up working at an NGO in Peru. And then 6 months later, the recruiter contacted me and said, "Hey, are you still interested in the position?" Like the person who we hired left. I said, "Yeah." And I interviewed, and yeah, I ended up there and moved from Peru to Honduras, and that's how I ended up. Because I had studied a little bit about USAID in my undergraduate for international relations, but when I was I did a lot of like UK kind of development focus, obviously, because I was studying in the UK. So there's this term called the Beltway Bandits that they use for federal contractors, because the Beltway is kind of the highway that goes around DC.
Yep.
But this was like completely new to me. I didn't know what I was getting into, so it was a big new
Wow.
experience.
Yeah, does that when you started then and you were writing, does that mean you were more of one of those boots on the ground kind of people, working on site as opposed to stateside, or what did that look like?
Exactly. What we call it is project staff. Long-term technical assistance is the U.S. government's term for LTTA. And so my salary was completely paid by the project funds. Whereas in the home office, you have people on overhead or general administration, like indirect costs. But I was completely paid for as like a project employee. So yes, we had we had 3 offices, one in Tegucigalpa, which is the capital, San Pedro Sula, and then La Ceiba. So I worked in the capital office. And so most of these projects have an office or headquartered in the capital, where they're close to the mission or the embassy, so you can have that client interaction. So yes, I was in the field. I get one of my favorite parts about working on USAID projects was getting to interview our beneficiaries, teachers and students and principals.
The people that get to be a beneficiary of the work that you're doing.
Of the work, yeah,
Just for our
exactly.
audience to kind of translate, the people that are winning because you're there.
Exactly. Yeah.
The whole point of what the aid is for, right? I mean, that's exactly
Right.
the idea is, yeah.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, and it's come up, especially this year, it's come up about the importance of the soft power and like, is this philanthropic work or are we doing it for certain objectives? But the work we do, the beneficiaries at the impact, like it's really important and it's really helpful. I was never on projects that were doing much life-saving work like malaria or food, that kind of thing. It was more governance or finance focused, trade and investment. So it wasn't like day-to-day life-saving, but it was improving the well-being of humans and communities around the world. Yeah.
That's a superpower. I mean, can we just all, okay, audience, can we all just soak that up? Like, these are projects that are benefiting people in some really profound ways. And Lucas, just let's take some time for a moment to just maybe talk about some of the projects that DAI has had impact. I know it's in a lot of different countries, but maybe you can just rattle off some examples for our audience who doesn't have experience necessarily with this kind of project work. We'd love to know about what kind of projects you've been involved with and others.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was on that project. I can start there because it was my first in the sector, and the title wasn't very catchy in English: School-Based Violence Prevention Activity. Um, but in Spanish, it was asegurando la educación, so securing the education. And so it fell under an education umbrella for USAID, but it was more about improving the safety in and around schools. So it was actually a very unique project. It had 12 different technical activities, and then we called it the peacock because there was everything would range like this. It was pretty cool. I was on the comms team, so our designers and other graphic comms people did a really cool job about that. But we would provide social emotional learning training in physical education classes to students, provide teacher well-being training, professional development, and then also on the flip side, because pretty much for every USAID project, you have to involve the local government, right? Because we don't get the buy-in and the ownership from the local government, it's not going to be sustainable.
That makes
Along
sense.
with the community too, right? So we worked with the national government to develop curriculum, as well as local government to make sure that they had the capacity that they needed to follow national level priorities. And then also we worked in the communities. So you got to have that kind of like multi-pronged approach.
Is the goal with something like that then you're then turning it over to the local government to sustain the project after you leave, or?
I mean, absolutely. Like I think USAID was created in the 50s, so and I'm pretty sure it was in JFK's administration, so it must have been later on. But I don't know if when they created it, if they imagined, 70 years later or whatever, that we'd still be doing this work. 50 years later, we'd be doing this work. So are we going to be providing aid to these countries forever? It needs to be sustainable. So that is a very important component because they're time bound, as all projects are, typically 5 years. So after 5 years, this money, this 20, 50, $100 million is going to not be there. How can this
Right.
be successful going forward, and who's going to take ownership?
Is that like an objective at the end of those?
Yeah, there's definitely a huge sustainability component. Each of our quarterly reports, annual reports, final reports, it's baked into the high level objectives in the contract. Like, how is this going to be turned over at the end? But there's also projects that have phases, right? So sometimes there's 3 or 4 iterations of the same project that just keeps going. So 10, 15, 20 years. Eventually, you need to make sure that it's sustainable, though. And so sometimes that's where we do see a lot of the criticism of international development is like, we've been doing this for so long.
Right.
Why are things not different now?
Why hasn't the baton changed in green grass basically at that point? Because we've sustained this for decades at this point.
Exactly.
What other work in other countries? So this is, you're talking
Sure.
Peru and
Yeah.
Honduras and
Yeah, and I was actually so after I was in Honduras, I was there during COVID, when COVID happened, and I don't like to use this term, but we were evacuated. It was pretty intense there, and we were going to stay, and then my project director, we call him chief of party, they're in charge of the project on the ground. He was like, I'm going, and he had been in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over, like back, early 2000s. And I was like,
I
well,
see.
if he's going, like, I'm not going to stay, like,
Yes, right. If he thinks it's time to
Um,
leave, it's time for me to depart as well.
yeah, yeah. And so I worked remotely then on the project for more than a year then, I think. But eventually I wanted to transition to the home office and get more into the project management aspect. So then once I did that, one of my first projects was a Ukraine project, actually. DAI had several projects in Ukraine. and
Nothing volatile happening there at
Yeah,
all.
yeah. Well, I closed that project. I helped to close that project in 2021, and I think we closed in October.
Oh my.
And so, 4 months later or whatever, the country was invaded, and
Yes.
we had several ongoing projects there, and they got a lot bigger because of the
Wow.
need.
I
A lot of
see.
infrastructure need, a lot of municipal services. We had DAI was doing projects to buy construction trucks and vehicles and providing healthcare infrastructure and equipment and stuff. So
I wasn't sure
we
what you
were,
were going to say. I actually thought you might be saying some of those projects got cut short. But what you said was there was this great
no, they
expansion
honestly
and
all grew.
explosion.
They were
Yeah.
exploded. They we saw 100%
Right.
growth in some of them or larger.
Wow. And does that then come from a stakeholder? Is there a discussion? Are we taking this on? Are we going to do more? Obviously it's a project pivot, it's a scope change, it's how else do you describe it? How does that transactional situation happen, the conversation?
USAID kind of had a reputation for being a notoriously complex and challenging client. We really don't have too much say, especially when it's something like that. Like not many, you don't have much say in that sort of a situation. Like no one really does. And so you just kind of react, I wouldn't say reacting, but you're transitioning, you're pivoting to the need. But since we were implementing, we were in conversations with the stakeholders, and we do know like this is what we've learned. And so
I
we
see.
are able to provide that learning and say like this is how things are going. Like I know this was the original objective, but it's just not possible at this point. And so the client
Wow.
would take those sorts of cues from us to develop their strategy or improve their strategies. So we were able to provide that kind of input, but
Hmm.
ultimately, it's up to the client as to how the project's going to transition. So COVID made a lot of projects transition. Things like war make
Hmm.
projects transition. So um, it can be very agile in a sense, even though they're kind of
Hmm.
predictive projects.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you really are, I would imagine feel that you are the middle person in getting that work done at that point where you had bid out this much work originally, and then that your stakeholders come in and say, no, 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 we need you to do 100 times that, right? And you need to mobilize your own troops to kind of get that going. That makes sense.
Yeah, and most of the big projects were cost plus fixed fee,
Mm.
CPFF.
Mm-hmm.
So um, the implementers would pay for the costs up front and then get reimbursed. And so
Mm-hmm.
that allowed for a lot of flexibility. And yeah, if there is that huge scope change, we do budget realignments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're not going to
Wow.
be doing a huge, we're not going to doing $100 million of work if it was only, originally $30 million, right? So
Yeah.
that is very iterative and then also open between the client and then the implementer. Like there is obviously not, they're not going to say like, you have to do this. Like obviously like the reality and profit comes into play because they're for-profit companies. So um, while it might not be that profitable of a space, you need to make sure you have the funds to continue proposals and have your HR team and all that. So
Yeah, and what kind of reporting too? Like how do you have how often are you having, communications with here's what's going on, here's what our capacity is, here's where the budgets are, here's what objectives we've met. Like what kind of reporting back are you doing, especially in these moments?
um, so typically the reporting structure is the chief of party or the project director in the
Mm,
country is in the
Mm-hmm.
country as the main counterpart with the client
mm,
for the technical execution.
right.
So a lot of times they're talking, chatting on calls with what we call the contracting officer representative, COR, core.
Okay.
That's the person that's like the technical uh, supervisor of the project,
Mm.
Okay.
working for USAID, the USAID employee. And so
Okay.
they'll have daily communication, right? They have weekly check-ins, daily communication. Sometimes the core will ask for information immediately, like within hours, or they'll say, okay, in a couple weeks, have this big presentation. So it can be quite dynamic. Um, but then we have the whole contracting aspect. So the core's supervisor typically is or supervisor for the project. They might have like a technical supervisor, but on the project, the authority is the contracting officer, which is typically a U.S. national that's posted in a U.S. expat that's posted in the country. And so that person is in charge of saying high-level decisions like budget realignments or certain salary approvals. it goes to the contracting officer. And so that
Wow.
communication is done through typically the home office. So my role as a project manager is I would be sending approvals or financial reports to the client or the contracting officer or the finance team. So typically you'd have um, formal weekly reports, quarterly reports, and annual reports, and then final reports, as long as and then a slew of other technical deliverables that are in the contract. And then also you would have quarterly accrual and projection reporting you would do as well for the financial part of it.
Wow.
Would that be for the life of the expected project life rather? So you'd be forecasting out the next 4 years if it was within the next 12 months, or what was your responsibility there?
I think missions would have different formats they would use.
Mm.
Typically, it would be 1 year out of forecasting. I mean, you'd have the project budget in the contract. You have budget line items in the contract that you're not supposed to go over, and so it was the contractor's responsibility to monitor that. But they're very focused on the run rate or the burn rate, the expenditure rate, and so how much money we're spending. And so they want to know that more in like a shorter forecast. So it usually wouldn't go past a year because honestly, it's hard to predict costs accurately past a year, even in these sorts of contexts, because we would do annual work plans, and so like if it was, and typically those happen around September following the U.S. government's fiscal calendar, September to October, or October to September. So if it's like May, and you want a forecast for May next year, like, well, you haven't even developed your work plan for next year. So there's an idea, right? There's like the high level project and contract budget line items, but when it comes to the shorter term forecast, yeah, it's typically more focused on a quarterly basis.
Well, I have a big question about just about how this conversation has all of a sudden gone. Like, we started out with these very fulfilling, sort of life-sustaining, well, always life-sustaining projects with big, superpowers. And then all of a sudden we got to reporting and the nitty-gritty and all the checking off and the line items and the things. And I wondered, and I'm sure our audience is wondering, do you lose sight of the life-giving objective of the project in the moments of the minutia of reporting and checking things off and budget and planning and approving, and is that lost somehow in the mix? How does a project manager keep their focus on this big mission but also check off all of the details that need to be dealt with?
Absolutely, 100%. And you see a lot in younger professionals that go to university for international relations or international development. They want to get out there and change the world. They want to see stuff happening. And then they get enrolled as associate and they're reviewing expenditures and they're drafting contractual approval requests. And so you see that a lot. It definitely gets lost in the kind of administrative, bureaucratic side of things. We do try to connect with our project staff as much as possible.
Yes.
One aspect for USAID is success stories, to share like very personal and powerful impact. And so we try to do those. We have at DAI, we had weekly reports that we'd highlight project success all the time. We have monthly meetings. We try to do it to try to keep engaged. But yeah, it is very easy to fall into like, I'm just reviewing how much we spend on coffee every month. Like, how is this helping anyone, right? So,
right. Okay, so
happens.
I'm pivoting now because you said these success stories, and you said, you're talking about projects that people just have these stories of impact. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have a project that you are part of that is just so meaningful to you, or that you found your work profoundly impactful, or just has a special place in your heart, or a country that you just really felt passionate about? Maybe there's one that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think just going back to my first example, because of my education and youth development focus, being able to be part of a really creative project, honestly, that doesn't have like the way it was set up is just not very typical. Being able to interact with beneficiaries in the school, see the students, talk to the teachers and the principals, and listen to their struggles, because Honduras is not a very secure place, and you hear some horrible, horrible stories about extortion and other things that we don't have to get into that are a little more gruesome. But so for me, that was just really impactful. I think because I was there, but also just because of my passion. I'll never forget, and I don't know why this moment stuck with me. We were up. I was visiting the project team to interview beneficiaries and at a school in San Pedro Sula. Actually, I think it was in Choloma, which is kind of like a district outside the city. And we were waiting for something. For some reason, we were waiting in the car, and we had finished the interview inside the school, and we were waiting outside in the parking lot. And there was just this, I don't know, fifth grader, sixth grader that had come out and was just standing by the gate or the wall of the school, and was just standing there, like the middle of the school, classes going on, people were going in and out, and some people were like sitting there, would stop and talk to him, and he just continued to stand there, and kind of like look lost or sad. I didn't really know what was happening. And right before we left, finally, either a teacher or principal came out and talked to him for a while, and then went back with him inside the school. And so for me, that was always just like a really powerful moment that, like, he could have gotten swept up and recruited in a gang on the street, but instead he was able to get back into the safe space in the school. So that was just really impactful for me.
I'm glad you got to see that moment because poignancy, stands out.
Yeah, and if I would have just, started out in the home office, we do get to have some trips where we go to the field, but typically we're just in the office, right?
Yeah.
And it just depends on the project too. Some projects are working with bankers and finance ministers to improve, non-banking financial institutions for
Sure.
for citizens, which isn't maybe very sexy, but it's very important and helpful.
Right.
So you really get a large dichotomy of the type of projects you can work on.
I think that really is important as to why you guys would share those success stories then with one another, because if you are the person who's literally counting coffee beans on the Excel sheet, right, you can the idea of losing sight makes a lot of sense. Not to get political by any means, right, but you were there long enough where you did see some administration change hands. Is that something that you would feel like in the initiatives that were done and the work that you would be doing?
It really depends. If it was an area that had a lot of media coverage, or someplace where a war started, or
Yeah.
countries that were sending a lot of immigrants to the United States, yeah, you would feel that kind of impact. Sometimes not. There's projects that were completely focused on, a lot of projects, especially in the Biden administration, were focused on climate change adaptation, right? And so you'll definitely, depending on the administration changes, you'll definitely see whole projects close. Honestly, that happens just because it doesn't follow certain priorities. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Interesting.
Definitely.
But I think for the most part, there was relatively little friction between administrations. Like, there'd be some projects that might get more funding or less funding, but for the most part, like, I think it stayed. I think because USAID was a separate agency than the State Department, there was a division of kind of the politics there. And so yes, it took its cues, and yes, certain things were the objective, but ultimately for staff that were working at USAID, was really about getting the work done and improving the situation on the ground for the cooperating country and its citizens.
So I want to just mention to the audience that you have your CAPM or CAPM or however everybody pronounces the certificate, but you're working towards your PMP. In fact, I'm going to make a little shout out to one of our partner organizations, Project Revolution, and Jeremiah Hammond, who's a friend of yours, but also a coach in that PMP process. They coach PMPs along in their track to get certified, and to not just get certified, but to get certified and be able to put those PMI or PMBOK best practices into their foundation of the work that they do. maybe you'd like to speak about that PMP process. Is it, has it been helpful to your work? Have you been enjoying it? Not necessarily the work with Project Revolution, because we know that's been great, but, what have you gleaned from the PMP path? I know Matt is actually on the PMP path himself, so
Oh, nice.
you guys might have some shared experience.
Great. Yeah. So I got certified with the CAPM in 2022, I think. So it's been a few years. Um, you don't see too many PMI certifications within the international development space just because they're pretty unique. And I think a lot of people feel like, oh, this isn't really too relevant to what we're doing. But to be honest, I wish I would have taken Jeremiah's course years ago, because thinking about now, I could have been, doing earned value management today. Ravina's like, wow, we could have really used some of these tools with USAID projects that I just hadn't really thought about before. Even with CAPM, I kind of like grinded out and memorized things, and so I didn't feel like I had like a wholesome understanding until now I'm taking the course with Project Revolution. And I really, yeah, as you say, it's like not just passing the exam, but utilizing the principles and making them work in the real life. And honestly, it's like a leadership course as well, which is a lot, like project management has a lot to do with leadership, so either directly or indirectly. So while some of the aspects are kind of far-reaching, as like a software development rollout is going to be a lot different, obviously, there's some good tools and processes that I think are really useful in this space.
That's really cool.
It really is. I think it's also neat to hear that somebody who has such an extensive background in complex project management then is like, no, the PMI standards are good, and here's the reason why, right? So
even retroactively, like, oh
Yeah.
I hear I learned this. You probably have so much, example food in your mind as you approach some of that certificate work. Like, oh yeah, if we had used this here, or that would have been better here, or well, we used this, it was a little different, or we used Agile and Scrum different than they're talking about waterfall. However that goes.
And some things honestly just wouldn't work either, But it's not
Right.
like PMI is new. I think it's been around
Right.
for like 30 years now,
Oh
right? But
yeah.
it's crazy
Yeah.
like how I mean, even people that are certified, like just not putting the practices into their real work. Like if you're not really actively thinking about it, it takes a lot of work to like proactively utilize those concepts. And yeah, I'm definitely going to make it a life kind of challenge to make sure I be a better manager and use those practices. Because yeah, like there
You
was lost
are
opportunities.
already. Where Matt and I are sitting here going, holy cow, this guy's got some serious skills. He speaks Spanish, English. I'm sure there's more languages under there, but you've taken so much in and really made it a part of your project management skill set already. Can you maybe think to yourself, what is your project management superpower? Do you have one that you think
Uh,
you?
I think it's probably relationship building. Um, I, I've always been really good about intimately knowing my colleagues and being able to work with them and understand how to communicate with them or what drives them or uh, leveraging relationships to get things done that maybe aren't following the normal process. Um, and I think I have a lot of demonstrable success about being able to start up projects quickly or procure computers or whatnot, just because I was able to reach out to certain individuals within the organization and build the trust with that working relationship.
I'm sure our audience can see that the projects you've been involved in are certainly unique, right? They're across continents, there's changing priorities, there's expand and collapse of the whole project plan, scope changes, pivots, budget changes, administrative changes, volatility in the countries that you're working. I mean, not many project management professionals that are listening right now find themselves in that kind of changing landscape, at all times. So when you say that you build relationships, that may seem, like just a little line item, but really those are moving parts in your world.
Mm,
And you have to have that huge superpower to let that be flexible, right? It seems to
mhm.
me from just hearing you for a couple hours in our conversations that we've had, I can pivot and move and quickly ascertain, who I might need to reach out to, what person I might need to know, who needs to know about this, what stakeholders need to be involved, and even, the relationships with the beneficiaries that you've said, like, are we meeting that goal for that end person who really is the whole reason we're doing this in the first place? So congratulations to you for developing that superpower. It's totally palpable. We see it, and we're happy to have it shine here on Wear Your Cape to Work, Lucas. We're so glad that you could be with us today in this podcast. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you.
Thanks, Gina. That's very kind. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. Really, it really has been wonderful to get to know more about you and the wonderful work that you've done, both for the United States and the world as a whole. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Thank you for joining us today on the Wear Your Cape to Work podcast, hosted by Project Insight. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, follow, or leave us a comment. If you subscribe to our YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or other favorite podcast channels, you'll receive notifications of all of our new episodes. We'd also love it if you would share Wear Your Cape to Work with your network of PMPs or anyone else who might enjoy the show. Project Insight is an online project and portfolio management software that helps companies connect project data from across all of their teams and software tools so that they can make confident decisions about their business. Our website is projectinsight.com, and there you can find many resources for project professionals, including free PDU webinars, as well as a place to register for a demonstration or a consultation with one of our success teams. Thank you once again for joining today's conversation, and most importantly, thanks for wearing your cape to work.